start by saying a little about my conversion, which is, it was kind of precipitated by finding the most interesting wrong people I knew, and then trying to explain to them why they were wrong. And then when that didn't work, reading their books so I could explain in more detail why they were wrong, and eventually finding out they were right. So there are two problems. One is that I don't believe in God, and the other is I don't have an idea of how to pray anyway.
And so where I grew up, it was foreign enough as a concept that in my AP European history class, we were studying the Reformation, and a kid raises their hand to ask, do Lutherans still exist? And this, as it turned out, this giant, blonde, crew-cut, blue-eyed guy is like, yes, they do. I'm a Lutheran. And we're like, what? So presumably there were some people who believed in God where I grew up, but quiet enough and visible enough that it made no impression on me. I wouldn't have been able to point to anyone except Greg the Lutheran, right?
And, for me, a lot of it started with the question of almost, if the eye responds to light in the physical world, and that's what vision is, what does conscience respond to? And kind of playing around with that question. And for me, the idea of weird transcendental truths wasn't that weird. I was a mathematician. I was used to the idea of there being true, beautiful things that were immaterial. But the more time I spent with the problem of how is it we come to have knowledge of the good versus how do we come to have knowledge of number theory, which to me felt like one of the highest goods. It was a much more complicated question, and ultimately it felt like it was much more probable that God existed, and the Christian faith was true, and that was the reason I had for having knowledge, for having my conscience respond to something the way my eye responds to vision.
That, in a large part growing up, religion was something I encountered primarily through TV, through politics, wherever religious people were kind of pushing their way into my life, right? Yeah. So what is religion about? It's about not teaching evolution in school. It's about trying to make everyone pray in public school. It only came up when it was intrusive.
Gotcha. Yeah, all right. And so, but your personal life, no cognitive thought about creator, God, somebody to pray to?
No, not at all. I had books on mythology, I had books on philosophy. I was more interested in the latter than the former. And what I was really interested in, the way that God was working in my life, not that I knew it at the time, is that I was really intensely interested in ethics and morality. And that really is a gift my parents gave me, because they weren't folks who said, well, we don't believe in God, nothing matters. They are intense moralists themselves. You have a responsibility to be a good person. You have a responsibility to serve your community. And for me, growing up, that meant you really have a responsibility to know what the right thing is to do, and then to do it. So I was a weird child in a lot of ways, right? But weird additionally in that most middle schoolers don't decide they're Stoics. But I had a big book of philosophy. I'm like, yes, Stoicism. This is true, right? It's all about what can you control, what can you not control, focusing on where you can act, not being upset about what you can't change, and being freer to act in the world, because you don't spend a lot of time and energy going, it's raining on me, and I'm wet, I don't have an umbrella, and I'm miserable, and just going like, will being miserable cause the rain to stop getting me wet? No, therefore, I don't mind. And if you are a middle schooler who is really into Stoicism, this becomes kind of a feedback loop, right? Because middle schoolers who are really into Stoicism are not popular middle schoolers. And then as a Stoic middle schooler, you go, there's nothing I can do to change the fact that people don't like me very much. So I will move on and be untroubled by it. So that was kind of where I was coming up from. Well, I got lucky. I think it was Campus Crusade for Christ was very sneaky. So they put up a big table that had a huge sign that said free books and didn't say in big letters from Campus Crusade for Christ. So I walked all the way across a courtyard to be like, books. And then I picked up Mere Christianity because I heard people speak highly of it. And what's funny about it is Lewis, in the first few chapters when he's just making the argument for a universal morality binding on everyone, sensible in some way to all of us, I could have torn out those first few chapters, just put a staple in them and gone, this is my evangelizing tract, right? Lewis and I agreed all through that point. And then we disagreed when he moved on to God in Christ. But it was exciting to read someone as excellent a writer as Lewis put down so clearly what I already thought was true. And then confusing to see that he had all this extra stuff tacked on.
Did you find his argument about God wanting, or you just didn't want to hear it?
I think I didn't find it compelling, in part because, I already believed the things about morality without ever having felt that implied the need for God. So I wasn't really, compelled when he kind of made that next movement. And for me, one of the questions I kept throwing back at people was, I never hear Christians say, with one exception, one friend of mine who is Eastern Orthodox, but with will accepted, people didn't say, how can you be a mathematician and an atheist? Where do you think math comes from? And I thought of morality and math as being kind of the same thing. And I was suspicious that people only made this, well, there has to be a creator argument for morality and not for math, when couldn't put their finger on why they were doing it for one and not the other. And now I suspect it was a little bit that they just weren't that into math. The same values and same way of making decisions, the same things that matters, and I sounded like them. And so at this point, I didn't want to have another terrible toasting thing, so I grabbed one of my friends who I knew wanted to go. He was Lutheran at the time. He's an Episcopalian now, but he's still in seminary, so I knew he wanted to be a priest. I figured that meant either he wanted people to come bother him with religious questions or he didn't want to be a priest, right? So he could figure that out now. So I bothered him. I'm like, Ben, every time I come up for debates, I have the impulse to become a Catholic, and it's very distracting. So we went to go talk about it. And that was when I kind of laid out my current set of problems and why I felt stuck for him.
You reminded me a bit of Newman, but the opposite. Because in the sense that when Newman, his awakening, if you will, the grouping, the lumping, was that when he looked at his story, he says, wait a second, I'd be lumped with the heretics. As an Anglican, he saw that if he was lumped, as you were saying, I'd be lumped with the Arians. I'd be lumped with the Monophysites, And so that was the awakening, to realize he was in the wrong place. You're finding you're lumped with the Catholics.
Yeah.
But not because of God, but because of virtue of morality.
Yep.
You're finding you're on the same page morally, regardless of where it came from. You're not there yet.
Yep.
Right?
And,
okay.
Well, so what I told Ben was my problem was basically, I think there is no God. I think morality is transcendent. It's something that humans don't make. It's something we have access to, like math, but it's fundamentally uncreated by us. And that problem of it's transcendent and we have access to it. And these last two things were hard to do at the same time. Because with math, first of all, as I told you, no one was giving me any guff about being into math and an atheist, right? Except for Will. But with math, we can kind of like sneak your way there, right? Like, there are these two mugs. There are the two lenses of your glasses. What's with these? How are they the same? They participate in the form of two-ness, right? And you can get into Platonism or not, but I found this sufficiently compelling that you could get to 2, you could get to 1, you could get to the natural numbers, to all of number theory, to everything else, that you could look around at the natural world and the jump was easy to make to understand the transcendent. But morality, it's harder to make that pitch, right? I can go, I see someone defraud an old lady, and I see someone kick a puppy. Now, these things are not intrinsically the same, no more than lenses or mugs, but they participate in the form of cruelty, right? And I just couldn't say with a straight face that that's as obvious as the lenses and the mugs, right? So I felt like I only could even recognize they both participated in cruelty because I already knew what cruelty was. I couldn't claim that's how I worked it out, right? So I lay all this out in front of Ben. And Ben's like, okay, so that sounds like what you've been thinking about for a while, and you don't think it works. So you should at least start trying to come up with new ideas. You should have been kind of treading water for a while. So if it's not that kind of, Plato ladder, what is it? And then I just said, spontaneously, I don't know, I guess morality loves me or something. And, that, I had to even pause to think what I meant, right?
Yeah.
But it was fundamentally the idea that if I can't build the ladder from my side, and I'm not going to, from my point of view, tell a lie and say morality is less what it is, so that I can make it something that I could have grasped for myself, but I have knowledge of it, then the motion must come from the other way around. It's not me reaching up and constructing something. It's morality offering itself to me. And
morality as a person?
That's the thing, right? You can't talk about a rule book offering, right? A rule book falls, right? It doesn't act. And at the point where you say, I believe in the form of the good that is, in fact, a person that offered itself to me, condescending to take the form of a slave. I knew who I was talking about, even if I hadn't meant to at the beginning of the sentence. And so it kind of really happened that fast. And most of the rest of the night was me kind of trying to poke holes at my own idea to see if I believed what I had just said. And then Ben suggesting that, when I did, that we should close out the night by praying night office, listening to Mumford and Sons, and then going to bed because it was about 2 a.m. And by the time I was walking back to where I was staying, it was past midnight. It was already Palm Sunday that night.
Wow. Yeah, I was going to say that before you saw that morality connects with a person, a source, all these things didn't quite fit of the Catholic Church. And what it sounds like is once, by grace, you realize that, now they connect.
It felt like almost like Catholicism was this complicated clockwork mechanism that didn't run, right? Because the more and more I'd studied it, the more I thought, it's coherent, it's just not true. If it were a fantasy novel, it would be a believable fantasy novel. It's not one of those kind of lazily written ones. It's almost like an alternate imagining of the world, but it just doesn't happen to be the world we live in. And that moment of morality loves me, the light came on in the middle and everything in Catholicism started like whizzing around and making little noises, right? Because if that were true, then it held.